I paid for every ticket, every hotel room, and even the rental car. But when I reached the gate at O'Hare, my daughter looked at me through the glass and walked onto the plane without me. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I wasn't confused. I wasn't late. I wasn't one of those older women who gets turned around in an airport and needs somebody to walk her to the right terminal. I had my boarding pass in my purse. I had my carry-on. I had a small box with a photograph of my husband inside it, because he was the reason we were all going to Hawaii in the first place. I stood at Gate K9 in Terminal 3, and I watched my own family board a flight I had paid $11,000 for. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 69 years old. I live in Naperville, Illinois, in the house my husband Richard and I bought in 1983 and paid off before he died. I spent 31 years as an administrative manager for a hospital network, which means I have spent most of my adult life reading contracts, catching billing errors, and noticing when numbers don't add up. I want you to remember that last part, because my daughter forgot it. That morning I got up at 5:30, even though Rachel had told me the flight left at 11:40 and she'd pick me up at 8. I've never in my life been late for anything. Richard used to tease me about it. He said if the world ended, I'd be there 20 minutes early with a folding chair. At 6:15, my phone buzzed with an automatic notification from the airline. Boarding begins at 8:20 a.m. I remember standing in my kitchen in my robe, holding that phone and thinking there had been some kind of system error. Airlines send out wrong information all the time. So I opened the app to check, and there it was, plain as day. Flight 271, Chicago O'Hare to Honolulu. Departure 9:05 a.m. Not 11:40, 9:05. I called Rachel. It rang twice and went to voicemail. I called again. It rang once. The third time it didn't ring at all. I told myself she must be driving. I told myself she'd see the missed calls and pull over. I got dressed faster than I've gotten dressed in 20 years, and I called a car, and I sat in the back of a stranger's Toyota on I-88, telling myself the whole way that this was a mix-up, that Rachel had misread her own itinerary, that we'd laugh about it at the gate. Isn't that something? On the drive to the airport where my daughter abandoned me, I was busy inventing excuses for her. I got to O'Hare at 8:40. Terminal 3 was packed the way it always is in July. I went through security with my hands shaking, and I walked. I nearly ran at 69 years old. In the shoes I'd picked out specially because they'd be comfortable on a 9-hour flight, down that long concourse toward K9. The board said, final boarding. I called Rachel again. Nothing. And then I got to the gate, and the young man at the podium told me boarding had closed, and I said there must be a mistake, because my family was on that flight, and he asked for my name, and he typed it in, and he got a look on his face that I will remember until the day I die. He said, "Ma'am, your reservation is showing as a no-show." I looked past him, through the glass of the jet bridge window, and I saw them. Rachel in her good travel jacket, the one I bought her for Christmas. Kevin behind her, already on his phone. Sophie, who's 10, holding her father's sleeve. And Noah. Noah is 16. Noah looked back. He saw me. I know he saw me because his whole body stopped and he half turned, and for 1 second I thought my grandson was going to do something. Then Kevin put his hand on Noah's shoulder and steered him forward, and the 4 of them disappeared into that airplane. That's when my phone finally rang. "Mom, you missed the flight." That's how she opened. Not, "Where are you?" Not, "What happened?" She said it the way you'd read a weather report. I said, "You told me the plane left at 11. There was a silence on that line. 4 seconds, maybe 5. I've thought about that silence more than almost anything else in this whole story, because in those 5 seconds, my daughter was deciding whether to keep lying to me or to finally tell me the truth. She chose the truth. I don't think she chose it out of honesty. I think she chose it because she was already on the plane and there was nothing I could do. She said, "We gave you a later time because we wanted one vacation where we didn't have to babysit you." babysit me. I said, Rachel, I paid for this trip, all of it. And she said, and I want you to hear this exactly the way she said it, because the tone matters as much as the words. She said, you offered. That doesn't mean you get to control everyone. Then I heard fumbling, and Kevin's voice came on. Just go home, Eleanor. We'll send pictures. And the line went dead. They thought I would sit in that airport, cry, and call Rachel to apologize. Instead, I walked to the airline counter and made the first decision of my new life. But before I tell you what I did, I have to take you back 3 years, because none of this started at that gate. What happened at O'Hare wasn't the beginning of anything. It was the end of something that had been going on for a long time, right in front of me, while I told myself it was love. Richard died on a Tuesday in March. Heart attack in the garage. Changing the oil in a car he could have paid someone else to service. 43 years of marriage, and I wasn't even in the room. I don't want to spend too long on that part. Not because it doesn't matter, but because I've noticed that when I talk about Richard, people start listening to me the way you listen to a sad old woman instead of the way you listen to a witness. And I need you listening to me as a witness. Here's the part that matters. After Richard died, Rachel came back into my life in a way she hadn't been in it for 15 years. She started calling twice a week. She started dropping by with the kids. She'd sit at my kitchen table and ask how I was sleeping, whether I was eating, whether I'd thought about what I was going to do with all that house. And God help me, I was grateful. I was so grateful. I had just lost the person I'd built my entire adult life around, and my only child suddenly wanted to be near me. I thought grief had brought us back together. I thought something good had come out of the worst thing that ever happened to me. The money started small. It always does. 3 months after the funeral, it was the roof. $2,200. Rachel and Kevin had a leak over the master bedroom, and their insurance was fighting them, and I had just come into Richard's life insurance, and what was I going to do? Let my grandchildren sleep under a leaking roof? Then it was summer camp for Noah and Sophie, $1,500. Then 2 car payments Kevin had gotten behind on, $900. Then a credit card balance that had gotten away from them, $4,000. Then Sophie's private school tuition, because the public school in their district had gone downhill, $11,000 a year. Then a kitchen renovation, because the old one was embarrassing to host in. Then new furniture, because the new kitchen made the old furniture look bad. Then a family vacation to Florida, because they'd had such a hard year. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think a lot of people listening will recognize it. I almost never said no. Not once did I sit down and add it up. I paid each one like it was a separate emergency, because that's how each one was presented to me. And every single time, there was an unspoken thing sitting on the table between us, and the unspoken thing was this. If I said no, I might not see my grandchildren for a while. Rachel never said that out loud. She was too smart to say it out loud. But there were stretches, after a phone call where I'd hesitated about money, when suddenly everyone was too busy for Sunday dinner. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then I'd send a check, and the next Sunday, everybody was free. I told myself I was imagining the pattern. I wasn't imagining the pattern. About 1.5 years in, Rachel asked me for something that wasn't money exactly. She asked me to add her to my credit card as an authorized user. She had a whole reason ready. What if something happened to one of the kids while I was watching them? What if there was a medical emergency and she needed to put something on a card fast? What if I was traveling and needed her to handle something at the house? It sounded reasonable. That's the thing about all of this. Every single step sounded reasonable in isolation. That's how it works. Nobody hands you a document that says, sign here to lose control of your life. They hand you 11 small reasonable things over 3 years. So I called the card company and I added my daughter as an authorized user, and I told her it was for emergencies involving the grandchildren. Do you want to know what emergencies came up? A steakhouse in Oak Brook, $280. A hair salon in Hinsdale, $190. Online shopping, clothes, a weekend hotel in Michigan. Gas, over and over, 3 streaming subscriptions in her own name, something at a jewelry counter for $410 that she never mentioned to me at all. The first month it was under $300. By the 6th month it was over $2,000, and I paid it. Every month I paid it, because I was the primary cardholder and the balance was legally mine, and because bringing it up felt like an accusation. Finally, one night in February, I did bring it up. I had the statement in front of me, and I asked her, as gently as I knew how, whether some of these charges might be personal. She got very quiet, and then she said, "I'm your only daughter. Why are you acting like I'm some stranger stealing from you?" And I backed down. I actually apologized. I said I'd just been going through the statements and got confused about a few of the line items. Confused. I used that word about myself, handed it right to her. Remember that word. It comes back. If anyone has ever made you feel unreasonable for asking a simple question about your own money, stay with me, because that one word is what they were building the whole time. Now I have to tell you about the trip, because the trip was my idea, and I need you to understand why it mattered so much to me. Richard had a thing about Hawaii. He'd been stationed near Pearl Harbor for 11 months when he was young, before we met, and he talked about Maui the way some men talk about a woman they almost married. He always said he'd take the grandkids someday. He wanted Noah and Sophie to see the water there. He'd say, "Ellie, pictures don't do it. You have to stand in it." He never took them. There was always a reason. Work, money, timing, a bad year. He died in March, and the following July would have been his 72nd birthday. And I decided I was going to do the thing he didn't get to do. I told them at Sunday dinner, in my dining room, with a pot roast on the table. I said, "I want to take all of us to Maui. Your father always wanted the kids to see Hawaii." Sophie squealed. Noah looked up from his plate and said, "Grandma, seriously?" And he had this look on his face, this genuine, wide-open 16-year-old look, like somebody had just handed him something he didn't expect. And Rachel said, "Which resort?" That was her first question. Not, "Are you sure?" Not, "Can you afford that?" Not, "How are you doing with Dad's birthday coming up?" Which resort? And Kevin, over the top of his water glass, said, "Are you covering the rental car too, or is that separate?" Nobody at that table asked me how I was feeling about any of it. Not one person. Except Noah, later, in the kitchen, drying dishes, who said quietly, "Grandpa really wanted to go, huh?" I said yes. He said, "Then we should go." I'm telling you that, so you understand. There was one person in that family who understood what the trip was. He was 16. Rachel volunteered to plan everything. She said I shouldn't have to deal with the stress, that she'd handle the booking, that all I had to do was show up. Here's what she booked: premium economy for the 4 of them, standard economy for me, an oceanfront suite for her family, a garden view room on a different floor for me, a private catamaran charter, a luau at $300 a head, a full-size SUV, dinner reservations at 4 different restaurants I'd never heard of, all of them the kind of place where you don't see prices on the menu. Every bit of it on my card. When the total came in and I asked, carefully, whether we might scale back a few things, Rachel said, "Mom, this is probably the last big family trip we'll ever take with you. Let's not ruin it by being cheap." The last big family trip we'll ever take with you. I was 69. I walk 2 miles most mornings. My cholesterol is better than hers. I let it go. Of course I let it go. But something in me filed that sentence away, the way you file away a strange noise in your car that you're not ready to take to the mechanic yet. 8 days before we were supposed to leave, Rachel came over alone. She walked through my house the way a realtor walks through a house, looking at the rooms, looking at the ceilings, and she said, "You know, you don't need 4 bedrooms." I told her I liked my house. I told her Richard and I raised her in that house. She said, "I know, but it's a lot of upkeep. You could move into one of those senior communities. They have transportation, meals, nurses on site." I said I didn't need a nurse, and my daughter smiled at me and said, "Not yet." Then, on her way out the door, with her keys already in her hand, as casual as asking about the weather, she said, "Hey, where do you keep the trust paperwork? Just in case." I said it was in the office. She said, "Okay, good." And she left. I stood in my own front hall for a long time after that door closed. Something was wrong. I couldn't have told you what. But my hospital administrator brain, the part of me that spent 3 decades catching things that didn't add up, was sitting up and paying attention for the first time in 3 years. I want to explain something about the paperwork, because it's the spine of this whole story, and I need you to follow it. Richard and I did our estate planning properly, back in 2011, with a lawyer named David Brooks who'd been Richard's friend since they coached Little League together. We set up a revocable living trust. That means the house, the Wisconsin cabin, and most of the investments are owned by the trust, and I'm the trustee. I control all of it while I'm alive and competent. We also signed durable powers of attorney. Richard was my agent. If I ever became unable to manage my own affairs, Richard could step in and act for me, sign documents, move money, sell property. And underneath Richard, as the backup, we named Rachel. Because in 2011, Rachel was 31. She had a 5-year-old and another on the way, and she was our daughter, and who else would you name? When Richard died, Rachel moved up. She became the primary agent under my durable power of attorney. I didn't think about it for 3 years. It never crossed my mind. That's the part I want anybody listening to really hear, because I don't think I'm unusual. I had signed a document that said my daughter could take over my entire financial life, and after my husband died, I never once went back and looked at it. Rachel looked at it. I found that out later. The night before we were supposed to fly out, I know now, because Noah told me, months afterward, that there was a conversation in Rachel's kitchen. Noah asked, "Shouldn't Grandma be leaving with us? Our car's coming at 5:30. And Rachel said, "Your grandmother changed her plans." Noah said, "She didn't say anything about that." And Kevin, from the other side of the room, said, "Stay out of adult conversations." My grandson went up to his room that night, knowing something was wrong and not knowing what to do about it. He was 16 years old in his parents' house, and the 2 adults in charge of him had just told him to be quiet. I've never blamed him, not for 1 second. But he blames himself, and we'll get to that. So now you know everything I knew standing at that gate. Now you know why, when Rachel said the word babysit, something in me finally clicked over. Here's what happened next. I sat down. There's a row of chairs across from K9, and I sat down in one of them, and I cried, in front of a couple hundred strangers, holding a box with a picture of my dead husband in it. I want to be honest about that. I didn't have a heroic moment at the gate. I fell apart at the gate. A woman sat down 2 seats over and handed me a travel pack of tissues. She said, "Missed connection?" I said, and it came out of me before I could soften it, "No, my family made sure I missed it." She didn't flinch. She didn't do the thing people do where they get uncomfortable and change the subject. She just nodded, slowly, like I'd told her something she already knew about. Her name was Carol Bennett, 71 years old, from Rockford, widowed 8 years. And she told me that after her husband died, her 2 sons decided she shouldn't travel alone anymore. They told her it wasn't safe. They started calling ahead to check on her. One of them suggested she hand over her banking so he could keep an eye on things. She said, "They said they were protecting me. What they really wanted was to make every decision for me." I asked her what she did. She said, "I booked a trip to Portugal, and I didn't tell them until I landed." Then Carol looked down at my carry-on, sitting there by my feet, and she said the sentence that changed the direction of my entire life. She said, "You're already packed. Your hotel is already paid for. Why would you go home?" I sat there and I looked at that bag. She was right. My suitcase was checked. Well, it was on its way to Honolulu without me, which is its own kind of joke. But I had my passport case, my carry-on, my medication, my wallet, and a hotel reservation in Maui in my own name that I had paid for with my own money. The only thing standing between me and Hawaii was the assumption that I wasn't allowed to go without permission. I got up. I thanked Carol. She wrote her phone number on the back of a boarding pass stub and told me to call her if I needed anything at all, and I want you to know we still talk every week. Then I walked to the airline service counter and I bought a seat on the 1:40 p.m. flight to Honolulu. Aisle seat, 12 rows from the front, $940, one way, same day. The woman at the counter asked if I was traveling with anyone. I said, not anymore. Now. I had 4 hours to kill before that flight. I have never in my life had 4 more productive hours. I opened my credit card app first. I don't know why I opened it. Something told me to look. There was a pending charge made 22 minutes earlier at a store in Terminal 3. $1,862. Rachel had walked from her gate to a duty-free and a boutique in my terminal, the one where she'd left me standing, and she had bought clothes, a pair of noise-canceling headphones, sunglasses, and a designer travel tote on my credit card in the 40 minutes before her flight. She had abandoned me at an airport and then gone shopping on my account in the same building. I called the credit card company from Gate K9. The representative was a young woman with a very calm voice. I told her I needed to remove an authorized user immediately, and I needed the card associated with that user shut off, and I needed to dispute a pending charge. She asked if the authorized user still had possession of the physical card. I said, she's on a plane to Hawaii with it. There was a small pause, and then that young woman said, I can take care of that right now, ma'am. She killed the card while I was still sitting there. Then she walked me through disputing the $1,800 charge. Then, and I hadn't even thought to ask for this, she offered to issue me a brand new primary account number, because if my daughter had the old one memorized or saved in a phone, she could still use it online. I said yes to all of it. For the first time in years, saying no didn't make me feel cruel. It made me feel awake. Then I called the resort. Here's a thing a lot of people don't realize, and it's worth writing down. I had made every one of those reservations. My name, my card, my confirmation numbers. Rachel had picked the rooms, but I was the one who booked and paid. So I got the reservations manager on the phone, and I want to be very clear about what I did and didn't do, because this part matters to me. I did not cancel my grandchildren's room. I want that on the record. Noah and Sophie had done nothing. What I did was this. I removed my credit card as the incidentals guarantee on Rachel and Kevin's oceanfront suite. The room was paid for. But every extra, room service, the spa, the minibar, the restaurant charges, the resort activities, all the things you sign for and pay at the end, every one of those had been set to bill to my card on file. I took my card off the file. If they wanted extras, they'd present their own card at check-in, like adults. And then I canceled my own garden view room, the one on a different floor, away from everyone. I booked myself somewhere else, a small hotel on the water in Lahaina, 40 rooms, no water slide, no lobby bar with a DJ. It cost less than the room Rachel had picked out for me. I was not going to spend Richard's birthday trip standing in a hallway waiting to be invited to breakfast. I landed in Honolulu at 7 that evening, local time. Then a puddle jumper to Kahului. I'm going to be honest about the next part because I think people romanticize this kind of story, and I don't want to. I was terrified. I hadn't traveled alone in over 40 years. Richard did the rental cars. Richard read the signs. Richard was the one who said, "It's this way," with total confidence, even when it wasn't. I stood in that Kahului airport at 10 at night, jet-lagged, with no checked bag because my suitcase had gone on the earlier flight and was sitting in a resort I was no longer staying at, and I did not know how to get to my hotel. I sat down on a bench and I thought very clearly, Rachel was right. I can't do this. And then I thought, no. Rachel needed me to think that. So I got up. I asked at the information desk, I found the shuttle. I got the shuttle to the wrong hotel first, and then I got a taxi, and I arrived at my little hotel in Lahaina at 11:40 at night, having sorted out 4 problems in a row entirely by myself. The young man at the front desk asked if anyone would be joining me, and I said, "No. This room is finally just for me." I want to tell you about the next 6 days, but not in the way you'd expect. I walked on Kanapali Beach in the morning before it got hot. I took a boat tour and got seasick and didn't care. I sat through a sunset at Lahaina Harbor and cried a little, and then went and had a hamburger by myself at a counter with a paper menu. I ate dinner alone 6 nights in a row. That doesn't sound like an accomplishment. For me it was. The first night I brought a book to hide behind. By the 4th night I didn't bring anything, and I just sat there and ate my fish and watched the water. And a woman at the next table asked where I was from, and we talked for an hour. I met 3 other women in their 60s and 70s that week. 2 of them were traveling alone on purpose. It had genuinely never occurred to me that a woman could travel alone on purpose. And on the 5th morning, early, before anyone was out, I took the small box out of my bag and I walked down to a quiet stretch of beach south of town, and I scattered a portion of Richard's ashes in the water. I'd carried that box through security. I'd carried it while I ran down a concourse. I'd carried it while my family boarded a plane without me. I stood in that water because he was right. You do have to stand in it. And I talked to him. I said, "They left me, Rich." I said, "I've been giving them everything because I was afraid they'd leave." And they left anyway. And standing there, 69 years old, soaking the hem of my pants in the Pacific Ocean, I finally understood the shape of the last 3 years. I had spent 3 years trying not to lose my daughter. Somewhere along the way, I had lost myself. Now, while I was doing all that, things were happening on the other side of the island, and things were happening back in Illinois. I'll take them in order. Rachel and Kevin got to the resort about 4 hours after their flight landed. Check-in, oceanfront suite, 4 people, 1 week. The front desk asked for a card for incidentals. Kevin handed over his. It declined. He handed over a second one. That one went through for the deposit, but flagged low available credit, and they had to call a manager over. Rachel called me from the lobby. I was in a taxi in Lahaina at the time, which I found extremely satisfying. She said, "Why did you cancel my card?" I said, "Because it was my card." She started shouting. She said, "You embarrassed me in front of the front desk." And I said, "You left me at an airport in front of hundreds of people." Then she did the thing, the pivot. I've seen her do it since she was 14 years old, and I never once recognized it for what it was until that moment. She said, "Mom, this is all a misunderstanding. We thought you'd be more comfortable at home." More comfortable at home. On the trip I planned for my husband's birthday that I paid for. So I asked her the only question that mattered. I said, "Then why did you let me pay for it?" She didn't answer. There was no answer. That's the whole thing about my daughter's arguments. They work beautifully right up until you ask one direct question, and then they just stop like a car with the battery pulled. She hung up on me. 2 days later, my phone rang with a 6:30 number I knew well, David Brooks, Richard's friend, my attorney for 15 years. He said, "Eleanor, are you sitting down, and are you somewhere you can talk?" I was on a lanai in Lahaina with a cup of coffee. I said I was. He told me that 11 days earlier, that's 11 days before the flight, Rachel had called his office. She didn't identify herself as calling on my behalf. She called and asked to speak to him personally, and she asked him a series of questions. She asked how to activate the durable power of attorney. She asked what documentation was required to establish that a person could no longer manage their own affairs. She asked whether, as the agent under that POA, she could take over my bank and investment accounts. She asked whether she could list and sell the Naperville house. She asked how a successor trustee gets appointed and whether she could become trustee of my trust while I was still living. And she asked, David repeated this one twice because he wanted to make sure I heard it. She asked what her share would be when I died and whether the grandchildren's portion would pass through her. David told her he could not discuss any of it because I was his client and she was not. Then he said something to me that I'll never forget. He said, "Eleanor, in 34 years of doing this work, I've had that phone call maybe 15 times. It is almost never innocent." And there was one more thing. 4 days before the flight, someone attempted a password reset on one of my investment accounts. Failed security questions, so it didn't go through, and the firm flagged it. The attempt came from an email address. It was Rachel's. I sat on that lanai with my coffee going cold, and I put it all together. The flight wasn't the plan. The flight was a step in the plan. Think about it the way I finally thought about it that morning. If I'd done what they expected, if I'd gone home from O'Hare and sat in my house and cried for a week, what would the story have been? The story would have been, Mom got the time wrong. Mom missed her flight. Mom couldn't handle a simple airport. Mom got confused. And who would hear that story? Kevin's family, Rachel's friends, anyone at church who asked how the trip went. Possibly a doctor at some future appointment, with Rachel sitting right there saying, "She's been having a hard time. She missed a flight to Hawaii this summer. She got the times mixed up. We're worried about her. She wasn't just getting me out of the way for a week. She was building a file." I said it to David out loud, and once I said it, I couldn't unsay it. She didn't leave me because she thought I was helpless. She left me because she needed everyone else to believe I was helpless. David was quiet for a second. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to change everything." We did it over 3 video calls that week, from a hotel room in Lahaina, with a notary David arranged locally and a witness from the hotel staff. Here is exactly what I changed, and I'm going to be specific because I've come to believe that vagueness is how people like Rachel operate and specificity is how you stop them. First, the durable power of attorney. Revoked. Entirely. The old document was formally revoked, notice went out to my banks and my investment firm, and a new one was executed naming David as my agent with a corporate fiduciary as backup. Rachel now has no authority, none, to sign anything, move anything, or speak for me anywhere. Second, the trust. My revocable living trust was amended. Rachel was removed as successor trustee. That role now goes to an independent corporate trustee, with David as the person who oversees it. This is the one that matters most. And I'll tell you why. Successor trustee is the position that takes over if I'm declared incapacitated. My daughter had been standing first in line for that job while making phone calls about how to prove I was incapacitated. Third, the house. The Naperville house stays titled in the trust, where it already was. It cannot be sold, borrowed against, or transferred by anyone but me while I'm living and competent. Rachel cannot force a sale. She never could have, actually, but she could have, as trustee after an incapacity finding, and that was the door I closed. Fourth, the accounts. Rachel removed as authorized user on everything. Removed as a listed contact at the bank and the investment firm. New account numbers, new passwords. 2-factor authentication on every account tied to a phone number she doesn't have access to. Fifth, and this is the one that made me cry on the call, the grandchildren. Noah and Sophie's inheritance no longer passes through their mother. Each of them now has a separate trust, funded with the corporate trustee in charge. The money can be used for college, for medical care, for housing, for vocational training, for a genuine emergency. It cannot be used by Rachel or Kevin for anything, ever. Noah's education is protected whether his mother behaves or not. That was non-negotiable for me. Sixth, Rachel's share. I want to be honest here because I know some people will think I didn't go far enough and others will think I went too far. I did not disinherit my daughter. She is still in my trust. But her share is substantially reduced from what it was. It's structured as a distribution rather than control of anything, and it comes with conditions. And seventh, A portion of my estate now goes to a national organization that works on elder financial abuse. Because I sat there in that hotel room realizing that I, a woman who spent 31 years reading contracts for a living, had signed away first position control of my entire life to someone who was researching how to use it, and I never even noticed. If it can happen to me, it's happening to a lot of women who don't have a David Brooks in their phone. The night after we finished the paperwork, Rachel tried to put a dinner on the card. They were at one of the restaurants she'd picked, the one with no prices on the menu. 4 of them. I found out later the bill was over $400. Declined. Kevin had to pay it, and from what Noah told me later, there was a fairly loud conversation about it in the parking lot. Rachel called me that night. I could hear the restaurant behind her, so she was calling from right outside, in front of her family. "You froze the card while we were on vacation?" I said. "No, Rachel. I canceled a card that never belonged to you." She said, "This is insane. When we get home, we are going to fix this." And I said, "No. When you get home, you're going to learn what has already changed." I hung up on my daughter for the first time in my life. My hands were shaking. I sat on the edge of a hotel bed in Hawaii and shook like a leaf and felt more like myself than I had in 3 years. The next morning I got a text from Noah. He'd waited until his parents were at the pool. He sent it from the room. It said, "Grandma, I knew they gave you the wrong time." Then, before I could answer, 3 more came through. I heard them talking about it Wednesday night. I asked Mom and she said you changed your plans. Dad told me to stay out of it. I saw you at the gate. I should have stopped. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I sat with that for a while before I answered. Because there were 2 things I could have done. I could have made him carry it, or I could have set it down for him. I wrote back, "You're 16. You were scared of your father and you didn't know what would happen if you spoke up. That is not your failure. It's theirs." And then I wrote, "But remember this feeling the next time someone expects you to stay silent." He wrote back almost immediately, "I will." And then, a minute later, one more message, and this one changed things. There's something else. A few weeks ago, Mom was in your office at your house taking pictures of papers with her phone. She said she was helping you organize. I didn't think about it until now. Photographs of documents. In my office. The room where I'd told her the trust paperwork was kept. I forwarded that message to David within 90 seconds. I came home 2 days early. I didn't tell anyone. Not Rachel, obviously, but I also didn't tell the neighbors, and I didn't post anything, and I didn't call anyone but Carol, who picked me up at O'Hare and drove me to Naperville and stayed for coffee. Then I got to work. I had the locks changed on Wednesday afternoon, front, back, side door off the garage. New deadbolts. I changed the garage door code. I had a security camera installed on the front door and one over the driveway. I changed the passwords on everything digital, and I mean everything, including the accounts you never think about, the pharmacy, the utilities, the insurance portal, the airline miles. I took the original trust documents, the deed, the titles, the insurance policies, and my will, and I put them in a safe deposit box at my bank. And David has the only other key. I called the bank and the investment firm and had Rachel removed as an emergency contact and as an authorized caller. And I called my doctor's office and updated my medical records so that my daughter is no longer listed as anyone who can receive information about me or make decisions for me. That last one took a phone call and a form, and it took about 11 minutes, and I would encourage every single person listening to check who is listed on theirs. By Thursday, my house was mine again in a way it hadn't been since Richard died. They flew home Saturday. They came straight from the airport. Didn't go home first. Drove from O'Hare to Naperville with the luggage still in the car. I know exactly when they pulled up because I watched them on the new camera from my kitchen with a cup of tea in my hand. Rachel came up the walk with her key already out. I watched her put it in the lock. I watched her try to turn it. I watched her take it out and look at it and try again. Then the doorbell. Once, twice, 4 times, and then knocking. I let it go about 30 seconds. Not out of cruelty. I just wanted to finish my tea standing up in my own kitchen, in my own house, on my own schedule for once. Then I opened the door. Rachel said, "Why did you change the locks?" I said, "Because you had a key to my house and you started acting like it was already yours." She moved to come in. That automatic, entitled half-step people make when they've never once been told no at a doorway. I didn't move. She actually bumped my shoulder before she registered that I wasn't stepping aside. And that's when she looked past me and saw David Brooks sitting in my living room, in the wing chair by the fireplace, with a folder on his knees. I have never seen my daughter's face do what it did in that moment. David stood up. He's a courteous man. He said, "Rachel, Kevin, have a seat." They sat, because that's what people do when a lawyer tells them to. And David went through it, item by item, in that flat, pleasant, deeply unimpressed voice that estate attorneys have. The durable power of attorney executed in 2011, revoked as of the 14th. Notice delivered to all institutions. New power of attorney, executed, notarized, witnessed, agent is David Brooks with a corporate fiduciary as successor. The revocable living trust, amended. Successor trustee changed from Rachel Whitmore Collins to an independent corporate trustee. All accounts, authorized user removed, contact permissions removed, credentials changed. The credit card, closed. The disputed charge from the airport, reversed, and if the dispute failed, she would be receiving a demand letter. The house remains in trust, sole control with Eleanor as trustee. Noah and Sophie, separate irrevocable trusts, funded, corporate trustee, no parental access. Rachel's share, reduced and restructured. When he finished, there was a silence in my living room that I could have poured into a glass. Then Rachel said, "You changed everything because of one missed flight?" And I want you to understand. She was not being sarcastic. She genuinely believed that's what this was. To her, the airport was one afternoon of unpleasantness that had gotten blown out of proportion. So I said it plainly. "It wasn't a missed flight, Rachel. You lied to me about the time. You took a trip I paid for. You called my attorney 11 days before we left to ask how to have me declared incapable. You tried to reset the password on my investment account. And you photographed my documents in my own office." Kevin's head came up on that last one. He looked at his wife. He hadn't known about the photographs. That told me something about their marriage that I've thought about since. Rachel said, "I'm your daughter." And here is what I said back. I'd been carrying it since the gate at O'Hare, and it came out very quietly, which I think made it worse. "You remembered I was your mother when you needed money. At the airport, you treated me like luggage you didn't want to carry." Kevin tried. He put his hands up in that placating way and said, "Look, we were only trying to make things easier." I looked at him and I said, "For whom?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. My son-in-law, who has been talking his way through a sales career for 20 years, could not finish that sentence. Then Rachel switched tactics, and she went for the children. She started crying. Real crying, I'll give her that, though I've stopped believing that real tears mean much of anything. And she said, "You're punishing Noah and Sophie because you're angry at me. You're taking their inheritance away because of a fight with me. How is that fair to them?" David didn't even let it sit. He said, "Mrs. Collins, that's not accurate. The children's provisions are stronger than they were 3 weeks ago. Previously, their inheritance would have passed to them through you as their parent and guardian. Now each child has a separate funded trust with an independent trustee. Their education is protected. Their medical care is protected. Their housing is protected." And then he said the sentence that ended the argument. "The only change is that you can't touch it." Rachel stopped crying almost instantly. I watched it happen. It was like a faucet, and I said, The children are protected. You're upset because you're not in control. Here's the part I didn't expect. Kevin broke, not dramatically. He just put his head in his hands and said, "Rachel, tell her." And little by little, over the next 20 minutes, it came out. They were in serious trouble. Not, "we've had a hard year" trouble. Real trouble. 61,000 in credit card debt across 5 cards. 2 car payments behind, with a repossession warning on the SUV. 2 years of back taxes on a rental property Kevin bought in 2019 that never rented the way he projected. A personal loan at 19%. And a second mortgage on their house that I did not know existed. Kevin's commissions had collapsed when the market shifted. Rachel's part-time job covered groceries and not much else. They were, by his own accounting, about 7 months from losing the house. And the entire plan had been my money. Not someday when Mom passes. That was too far off. They needed it inside a year. Which meant they needed control while I was still alive. Which meant power of attorney. Which meant an incapacity finding. Which meant building a story. And the story needed evidence. And the evidence was going to be a confused old woman who got the time wrong and missed her own flight to Hawaii. That's when I finally understood that my daughter hadn't been selfish. Selfish would have been easier. Selfish I could have almost forgiven. My daughter had built a financial plan that required her mother to be incapacitated or dead. I sat in my chair and I looked at the two of them, and I felt something I hadn't felt through this entire thing. I felt calm. Because once you know what someone actually wants, you stop being confused. And I have never in my life been afraid of a problem I could see clearly. So I told them how it was going to be. I said, "I'm going to keep loving you. I don't have another option. You're my child and that doesn't come with a switch. But I'm not funding you anymore. And here's what that means specifically, so nobody can claim later that they misunderstood. No access to any account, not now, not later, not in an emergency, no authorized user cards. Ever again, no loans, not $1. Not a bridge loan, not a short-term thing. Not just until the commission comes in. No key to this house. No medical authority over me, and no calls to my doctors. No further conversation about the trust, the will, the house, or the inheritance. That subject is closed permanently. If it comes up, the visit is over. No unannounced visits. Call first, like an adult. And no using my grandchildren as leverage. If Noah and Sophie are kept from me as punishment, that will be noted, and it will be handled." And I said that last part while looking directly at David, and Rachel understood exactly what I meant. Then I said the thing I'd figured out standing in the Pacific Ocean. "I'm still your mother, but I am no longer your bank, your retirement plan, or your emergency credit line." Rachel said, "So that's it? I apologize and nothing changes?" And I said, "You haven't apologized. You've explained. Those aren't the same thing." She didn't have an answer for that either. They left about 10 minutes later. Kevin carried the folder David gave them, copies of the revocation, the amended trust certification, the notices to the institutions, reading material for the drive home. Noah came to see me about 3 weeks after that, alone. He drove himself. He'd just gotten his license in the spring. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where his mother used to ask me for money, and he said, "I saw you at the gate. I should have stopped." I told him what I'd told him in the text, but this time out loud, and out loud is different. I said, "You were 16 years old, and both of your parents told you to be quiet. You did what almost every kid would do." He said, "That doesn't make it okay." And I said, "No, it doesn't. Being afraid doesn't make you a bad person. Letting fear decide who you become can." He thought about that for a long time. Then he asked me if his college money was really going to be okay, and I could hear in his voice that he'd been carrying that fear around for weeks, that his grandmother's fight with his mother was going to cost him his future. I told him about the trust, his own trust, his name on it, an independent trustee, his mother with no access. He put his head down on my kitchen table and cried like he was 6 years old. 16 years old, and he'd been lying awake, worrying about whether he'd be able to go to college, because he'd figured out that the adults in his house were in trouble and that his grandmother was the plan. That's what this kind of thing does to children. Nobody talks about that part. It's been a little over a year now. Rachel and Kevin sold their house in March. They didn't have a choice. The second mortgage and the tax lien made it impossible to hold. They're renting a 3-bedroom in a decent district about 20 minutes from where they were. Sophie changed schools. She cried about it. That's real, and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't bother me. But I'll tell you what I've had to sit with, and it took me most of a year and a very good therapist to get there. Their house sold because of $61,000 in credit card debt, a bad rental property, 2 years of unpaid taxes, and a 19% personal loan. It did not sell because I stopped writing checks. I did not cause that. I was just no longer available to postpone it. Rachel started therapy in the fall. I know that because Noah told me, not because she did. From what I understand, it started after Noah told her, flatly in the kitchen, apparently at some volume, that he'd seen what she did at that airport and that he wasn't going to pretend he hadn't. Losing my trust didn't move her. Losing her son's opinion of her did. I've made my peace with that. Whatever gets a person to the chair, gets them to the chair. She and I talk now. Every couple of weeks, on the phone, and once a month or so, she comes for lunch. We talk about the kids and the weather and her job and a show we both watch. We do not talk about money. Not once, in a year. She has not gotten a single thing back. Not the card, not the key, not a position in the trust, not authority over anything. And she hasn't asked, which I notice, and which is the only real evidence I've seen. I've told her the truth, which is that I'm not withholding those things as a punishment I'll eventually lift. Those things are simply not coming back. What can come back, over years, is trust. And trust is built by behavior, not by apologies, and not by holidays. She's earning it slowly. That's the honest state of things, not a reconciliation. A negotiation. I went back to Hawaii this summer. Carol came with me. So did 2 other women from a travel group I joined. 60-plus women, mostly widows, mostly people whose adult children have opinions about whether they should be doing this. We stayed 9 days. I took the same boat tour and didn't get sick this time. I stood in the same water. I also started doing something else this year that I want to mention, because it's the part of this I'm proudest of. I volunteer twice a month with an organization that works on elder financial abuse. Mostly I sit with women my age, and it is almost always women, and I help them understand what they've signed. Who's their agent under their power of attorney? Who's the successor trustee? Who's on their accounts as an authorized user? Who's listed at their doctor's office? You would not believe how many of them have never looked. I hadn't. I spent 31 years reading hospital contracts, and I had never once read my own. Last month, a woman of 74 sat across from me and said, "But she's my daughter." And I said, "I know, mine too. Let's look at the paperwork anyway." Noah starts college in the fall. He got into his first choice. He's going to study accounting, of all things. He told me he wants to be the person who notices when the numbers don't add up, and I had to leave the room for a minute after he said that. His trust is funded and untouchable, and he knows it, and that boy has slept fine for a year. Last week I flew out of O'Hare again. Terminal 3. I had time before my flight, so I walked the long way around, past the shops where my daughter spent $1,800 of my money 40 minutes after she left me standing there. And I walked past K9. There's a row of chairs across from that gate. I stood and looked at them for a second, at the specific chair where a 69-year-old woman sat and cried in front of 200 strangers with her husband's picture in her lap. I wanted to tell her something. That's a foolish thing to want. But I stood there and I wanted it anyway. I'd have told her, "They are not leaving because you didn't give enough. They're leaving because you gave so much that they forgot you were a person who could stop." Then I looked down at my boarding pass, and I found my gate, and I got on my plane. Rachel thought leaving me at that airport would prove I couldn't survive without her. Instead, it proved I had been carrying her for years. Love without boundaries becomes permission. I didn't stop loving my daughter. I stopped paying to be loved.